Hello everyone, welcome back to the third lecture of the lecture series. This is Public Health, which is brought to you by ETH and the Swiss School of Public Health. For those of you who are not familiar with me or who did not join us previously, my name is Emily Reeves. You might know me from the Dubai Expo project of the Swiss School of Public Health, and perhaps you even took part in some of the Dubai Expo training program. You may know me from there. It's great to see some faces live, and also hello to those of you who are joining the live stream. And please don't forget that if you would like to ask a question or if you would like to give any feedback or comments to the lecture, you can use the Zoom link as well. So even though you cannot ask questions via the live stream, the Zoom link is available for those who do want to ask a question. Today, I just thought I would bring up something very small. Of course, it was International Women's Day yesterday. So in honor of that, today I wanted to show a short video clip that was created by one of the students who actually won the chance to present the outcomes of his training at the Dubai Expo at the Swiss Pavilion. And his name is Ezra Valido, and he's from the University of Lucerne. He put together this short montage of what women are doing from the Swiss School of Public Health generally in our community, and he presented it as a result of the expo. So I'd love to show a YouTube video, which is very short. I think it's just 2 minutes, and it's honoring women in public health sciences. So if you bear with me a minute, then we're going to get up this YouTube video that you can watch. And in any case, there's also a link here below, which is highlighted in yellow. This link, just to let you know, is a link that takes you to a page for support in case you have been influenced in any way, directly or indirectly, with what is going on at the moment with the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so I think we are ready to show the video. Okay.
So Anna, how do you find the expo?
The expo is a great opportunity to get to know what the other countries are doing about the Sustainable Development Goals.
And how is it representing SSPH+?
Well, I must tell you that being here representing SSPH+, being part of the Swiss Pavilion, representing University of Bern, is a dream come true for me. I love science communication. This is what I want to do in my future. So this is just perfect for me. I'm really, really happy.
So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully that gave you a bit of an insight into some of the women in public health sciences who are based in Switzerland at one of the many institutions across Switzerland associated with the Swiss School of Public Health. I glanced over it earlier, but I did mention there, again, please feel free to go to the highlighted link should you wish to have access to any counselling services that are available at ETH, and there are a number of these kinds of services available at any of the institutions affiliated with the Swiss School of Public Health. So today, without further ado, we do have with us Professor Martin Röösli, who also was speaking with us at the Dubai Expo. We had the pleasure of listening to him there. He is based at the Swiss School of, he is based at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute in Basel. And I personally heard him speak at the Dubai Expo, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing him speak again on this very interesting topic. And the title of it is Transportation Noise, Health Threat or Just Annoying? I think we're looking forward to finding out what the answer of that is. So I hand over the floor to you. Martin, in the meantime, I will make sure that the technical connection is set up so that you're able to see his slides.
Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. I just started. It's really a pleasure to be here. Actually, I studied here, and today when I walked through the hallway, I took a picture of this hallway a little further down in the building, and it just reminded me when I was here 30 years ago, I had to do an exam to get enrolled at the ETH, and I really felt miserable when doing that exam to get this enrollment. And in the middle of the exam, I called the secretariat of the examination, said, stop, this is useless, I will not pass by any means. And she convinced me to actually not give up and just go through it. And so I did, and finally I did it. And so I studied, had very nice 5 years here. And yeah, it's just interesting to see how life develops. Sometimes these small events that have quite some impact on the further process. Not sure what would have happened otherwise. What would I do now? So what I would like to talk today is about sound, and what is sound, what is noise, about different health effects, whether it's annoying, about cardiovascular effect, and other potential health effects. And then quite a bit of my talk I will dedicate to a proposal which has been recently done by the Noise Abatement Commission for new noise regulation in Switzerland. And I would like to talk on actually how can noise guidelines, and this may be typically for other environmental guidelines, be developed, which, as you will see, is not a very simple task, as there's quite a lot of decisions involved into it. Let's start with sound. If we hear something, if you listen to me, the sound is processed through your ears, and then it goes directly in the most central region of the brains. So it goes in the brain region that control the vegetative functions. It goes in the limbic brain where the emotions are located, amygdala, the center of fear, and all these aspects. So it's not surprising that sound has quite some impact on our emotions. It can be very nice, so if we hear nice music, we will be happy and feel very good, but we can also become quite angry when we are exposed to noise. And as said, I mean, in this very vegetative functioning of the human being, basically the ear never sleeps. Even if we sleep and the eyes are closed and the visual system is relaxing, the ear is still processing the environment. And this is very important because if something happens during night, for instance, we need to react. And probably this was an evolutionary advantage that this happened. But nowadays, maybe most of the sound that we hear during night is not very dangerous, and to have constant processing of that may be an issue, and let's look into it. Just a little bit of basics about noise. Basically, it's measured on a logarithmic scale. I don't want to go into detail, but that you have a feeling of the levels of noise, typically like in the area here, a typical level would be 60 decibels. If you're close to a road which is heavy traffic, it can be 70 to 80 decibels. If you are above 85 decibels, the hearing may be impaired, and if it's far above 100 decibels, it would even hurt you. And if you go down, 30 decibels is already very, very low noise. It's almost unhearable, and 0 decibels is the hearing threshold. When is it noise and when is it sound? Actually, this is a matter of judgment to some extent, and basically the main definitions used in research means that audible sound that causes disturbance, impairment or health damage is noise. And sometimes it's actually not so clear what is then the difference, and maybe different people may judge differently whether it disturbs or whether it does not disturb. In this lecture, I will also talk about the typical measure used in noise research, which is the LDEN. This is an average of 24 hours, which has some penalty in it, with 5 dB added for evening noise and 10 dB for night noise, just to reflect the higher disturbance potential of noise during night. Just that you are aware of that if you see this LDEN, what this means. It's very interesting in German. The word Lärm, alarm, actually comes from take up the weapons, and you probably may realize that if you hear sound, it can immediately stress yourself. Maybe you want to escape, you want to flight. And this is the typical stress reaction which comes with noise. So either you fight or you flight. And obviously, if this is a short-term reaction, this is not a big issue. I mean, there's a lot of short-term stress. But if this is a long-term issue and your HPA, the stress hormones, are increased over a longer time, and the vegetative nervous system, the sympathicus, is activated, this can be a problem for health in the long time, if you have this chronicity of stress as for other stress as well. Obviously, noise is and can be annoying, and this is just a graph from a survey that we have done in Switzerland as part of the so-called Siren study. So this is a representative survey of almost 5,600 people, and we have modeled what is their noise at the place where they live, and they have rated their noise annoyance, and this is typically done with this scale from 0 to 10, and people can then say whether they are annoyed like on the 9 or 8 or 7, and there's an international standardization that 8, 9 and 10 is considered to be highly annoyed. What can be seen, this graph is for the different sources like road traffic, railway and aircraft noise, that these curves are different. So for instance, if somebody is exposed to 60 dB, then about a bit more than 10% of the population would say, if this is road traffic noise, I feel disturbed or highly annoyed. If it's train noise, then it's a bit higher, and if it's aircraft noise, then it's even more than 30%. So there's clearly psychological aspects, different aspects that play a role for annoyance, and this includes, for instance, obviously the level. But even at very low level, if you have a look here, you see some people still being annoyed, highly annoyed. Then, of course, the timing plays a role. Obviously, during day, you may be less disturbed than during night. Then it depends whether you have control over it. own sound may not be perceived as noise even. Also predictability may play a major role. So for train noise, you basically know what will happen, whereas for aircraft noise, sometimes it occurs. If the weather situation changes, there is no noise. So there's much less of control about that type of noise, and this may be one explanation why aircraft noise is always perceived as much more annoying than other noise. Then the sound, the characteristic may play a role. For instance, if you hear people screaming or talking, chatting from a bar, this is usually more annoying than just white noise, or less if you have a lot of impulse, tones, like a bell, for instance, is made to be perceived, and this is really something which is then also to some extent more disturbing. And it may play a role what you think about the source, whether you think this is reasonable. So maybe a lot of people think road traffic is unavoidable, but maybe aircrafts is something which is not supported to the same extent. Things like that may also play a role. And whether the noise is far away or very close has also an impact. So basically, I don't want to go into details, but it's quite complex, and actually recent studies also looked into it quite well, that all these stress reactions have an indirect effect, what is called here on the right side. It does not need that you are annoyed. Even if you're not annoyed, you can measure then the stress impact in blood pressure, increase of blood lipids, blood sugar. So all these typical stress reactions to have the energy to flight will happen, which then have potential effects on cardiovascular disease and metabolic diseases like diabetes. And also the indirect or the direct effects, which one part is hearing problems. I don't talk about that, but if you're disturbed in sleep, and if this happens chronically, this has also quite some impact on the metabolism. A lot of people eat differently if they don't sleep very well. They eat more. They don't do physical exercise anymore. Also, the pulse and the vegetative nervous system is more activated with little sleep. All this contributes as a risk factor to cardiometabolic disease. And to prove that and to look into that, we have done a nationwide cohort in Switzerland, looked into the data from all Swiss people above 30 years of age between 2000 and 2015. This is data where the registry data or census data before 2010 has been linked with mortality data. So we had information about sex, civil status, and socio-demographic factors which play an important role for that research. So you would expect that people are not randomly distributed in terms of noise, but maybe people with lower resources, economic resources, they need to rent houses and apartments which are cheaper, and usually cheaper apartments are noisier. Obviously also air pollution plays a role, so this is also included. And then we looked on the association, and that is what comes out of a model basically for all cardiovascular disease and road traffic noise, where we have modeled the association non-parametric without putting any pre-requirement on how this function should look like. And it's very interesting. It almost is a linear curve, a linear line, although we could take any form based on our model specification. What we see here is the distribution of road traffic noise in Switzerland. So you see about the average is around 55 decibels. Some people are exposed up to 70 decibels with these average LDN measures. In red is what the WHO proposed as the guideline for road traffic noise, which is 53 decibels. So there's even more than half of the Swiss population exposed above the guidelines from the World Health Organization, and this risk is linearly increasing. So here are the curves modeled in a similar way for railway noise and all cardiovascular disease, and for aircraft noise, which starts to increase after 40 decibels. Obviously, a lot of people are not exposed to aircraft noise at all, which are here. And typically, associations also in other studies, I mean, there's quite a lot of this type of studies worldwide, is strongest for myocardial infarction, where we have the risk increase here. We often then basically approximate the association as a linear curve and express it as a excess risk per 10 decibel increase in noise exposure. And on the right side, you see the corresponding figures, which are between basically 0 for aircraft noise if it's modeled just as over the whole spectrum. Would be a bit different if only the upper part were taken into account, and up to 3%, and for myocardial infarction it's between 2 and 4.3% in this study, which is quite in line with what other studies found as well. What is very interesting, when we looked into a small cohort where they have measured the amygdalar metabolic activity and arterial inflammation in this cohort over 4 years, 40 people of this cohort developed a major cardiovascular disease event, and the likelihood to have such an event and to survive such an event was related to the noise exposure. So you see in the red curve, people with higher noise exposure had a higher likelihood to die from such a major cardiovascular disease event and to experience one. And what was very interesting is that if brain images were done in people with such an event and having high noise exposure compared to those without such an event and low noise exposure, there was quite some difference in the amygdalar activity, indicating that this plays an important role for that stress response. And when they did pathway analysis, they found basically this pathway that noise activates the amygdalar activity, that this leads to arterial inflammation and then finally can result in certain cases to a major adverse event. So when you look into that, obviously the question comes up, maybe there's not only long-term risk from noise exposure, but also acute risk if you have this amygdalar activated, and that is something we have looked into it. So we have conducted a so-called case crossover study where we included all cardiovascular deaths that occurred around the airport of Zurich between 2000 and 2015, and looked whether the short window prior to the death, whether this was more noisy than what you would expect from statistical distribution. So this is the study area. Basically, we took the study area that has a certain amount of noise, and this depends on the flight routes. So it's basically a bit distributed. We took into account other triggers of cardiovascular mortality, like cold and heat is well known, and obviously also air pollution, which is a well-known trigger of cardiovascular mortality. And all these events were taken, or all these exposures were modeled for each person in this study, for each event, and was compared with expected distribution of these factors. And here the results for noise, we could also observe the effects or associations for the other factors. But what is clear that basically if nighttime, so if you only look into deaths that occurred during nighttime, then the exposure prior to this death 2 hours before was related. There was an association which was most prominent for ischemic heart disease and myocardial infarction. And the increased risk that we see here is about the same, I would say, as if you have like the triggering potential of strong negative emotions, which is also known to trigger cardiovascular events. For ischemic stroke, heart failure, and arrhythmia, the relation was a bit less clear, at least not significant. And we didn't see, that was the second hypothesis, that if you have a bad night, that there might still be a delayed effect during cardiovascular death during the day. But this we could not confirm with that study. But just showing that actually both chronic and long-term disease may play a role. So this was the cardiovascular part, and obviously I could show you many more studies, but there are other studies, for instance, the Sapaldia study that has done by Nicole Probst from the Swiss TPH, or is still doing for many years now. It started in 1990 as a cohort study on air pollution, which obviously is also very suitable to look into noise effects. And here, for instance, we see associations between road traffic noise and diabetes. For aircraft noise, the point estimate is even higher, 1.86, but actually the exposure is not that common in this cohort, so it's not significant. If we compare, again, very interesting, if you run splines, you get very linear exposure-response relationship. And if we compare with other studies in that field, it fits quite well that the association between road traffic noise and diabetes is quite consistently observed in different cohort studies. Whereas for aircraft and railway, there are less studies and the picture is less clear. Although there's no reason from a physiological point of view why railway noise or aircraft noise should have different effect. I think the main point here is that road traffic noise just is more prevalent, so there's higher power to really look into it. In the Siren study, where we have done this analysis in the epidemiological study, we also looked in the lab what happens short term on the metabolic rate, and this was done by Christian Gajochen's group in Basel. And basically, they had volunteers. They stayed for 5 days in the sleep lab, and during night they received different levels of noise exposed. And what can be seen, if they did a glucose tolerance test in the morning, then obviously the glucose in the blood goes up, and after a certain time, if the insulin response is coming, it goes down again. So that's the natural process. And the quicker this works, the better it is. And the slower it works, it may be an indication that you're at a higher risk for developing diabetes. And it's also quite interesting that even after one night of noise, that then this response to this glucose was delayed compared to baseline night without noise or after the recovery night. When there was more noise, what can be seen here, then even after the recovery night, it went not back, so then it probably needs more than one night to really come back to the original state again. Okay, there's also quite some hypothesis that noise could affect mental health, but here the studies are not that common so far. In the Sapaldia study, they have also looked, or we have looked into it, and we found not really convincing evidence. But if you look at all the studies combined with previous studies from a systematic review, it seems that there might be, at least for road traffic and aircraft noise, something going on, but it's certainly an area where we miss good studies and where additional research is needed. And then the last point, which in terms of health effects is quite well investigated, is cognitive effects and behavioral effects in children and in adolescents. And many studies pointing to such effects, that children get more hyperactive, more aggressive if they are exposed to noise. And here this is just a about the study that we have done in Sao Paulo, where we have measured noise, we have modeled the noise, and actually the noise levels were quite high in that area, with an average of 70 dB LDN. And what we could see is that in these children, if we looked at the development between the age of 3 to 6, that this really had major consequences for the cognitive function in relation to noise. So certainly something which then propagates into the long-term adulthood, and that is for sure an issue then also in terms of chances for these children if they already have such a bad start in the education system. So to summarize, and before I come to the development of guidelines, we can say that noise is in Europe at least, and there's less information for other continents. The second most relevant environmental health burden after air pollution. There's still relatively little awareness for that. I think it's not discussed too much compared to other health problems. Although if somebody is concerned with noise at their home, then usually the awareness is quite high. So that's quite interesting. But if people have not experienced it, then usually it's not considered as a major issue. I would say for acute coronary heart disease, the evidence is very clear, very high, whereas for other disease, there's still many open questions in relation to the level of associations in how certain we can be about health effects. Also very interesting, a lot of people think that you can get used to noise at home, and that is what you subjectively perceive. You don't hear maybe the bell ringing every evening, whereas at the beginning you heard it. But this is just on the perceived exposure. If you would measure like the brain waves and the arousals, cortical arousals, you could still see that basically the sound is processed during night. And also the idea that people who are not annoyed don't get health effects is also something which could be shown that this is not true. So the physiological reaction may also happen in people who claim to be not annoyed. There's also a health impact assessment. I keep that, and obviously this costs a lot. But let's talk a bit on prevention and regulation. And I find that quite interesting also in the times of COVID nowadays, that Robert Koch already 200 years ago almost said that noise will be quite an issue and that it will be fighted against noise. And the WHO has published guidelines, I have mentioned them before, in 2018, what should be the ideal noise exposure. So it should be below 45 decibels in the evening and around 53, 54, maybe for aircraft lower, during the 24-hour average. And as we have seen, actually, the true exposure is much higher, even in a country like Switzerland, which is maybe not famous to be very, very noisy. And also the Swiss regulation limits are quite higher than the regulation proposed by the WHO. So the Federal Noise Abatement Commission has proposed new noise limits in the end of 2021. Maybe some have seen that. It was not very prominently in the media when this was introduced. There was many other things ongoing. Just to give you an idea how this works, development of such standards, and obviously it has nothing changed yet. It's just now with the federal councillor, and we will see what will happen. Maybe nothing happens, hopefully not. But basically, the Swiss Ordinance for Noise has been created in 1987, and it has not changed except for aircraft where some additions were being done in 2001. And then the EKLB, that's this Noise Abatement Commission, they have discussed in 2008 that basically these guidelines are outdated, that something should be done about it, and they don't reflect the scientific state of knowledge anymore. At that time, in the 80s and 90s, there were no studies. I mean, this was just based on a bit expert judging, a bit asking about annoyance, but otherwise there were no real scientific literature. And at that time, a synthesis report was done, and it was said that really a program has been made, what should be looked at, that we have more scientific base to do the regulation limit. So the need for action was recognized, and this research concept has been made. And we have met, at that time I joined the Swiss Abatement Commission. So we have met Doris Leuthard, who was the councillor at that time, and have said that really something should be done, and that one should do this type of research. But she thought that's not very important, and if somebody does not like noise, the person can go can move to the green space where it's quieter. So that was a bit frustrating. So we have decided to ask for other funding, and we had the Siren project funded by the SNF, and also at the same time these noise guidelines have been developed. There was some interaction, and this was the basis now then to develop limits for Switzerland. And just that you see the legal basis, basically in the federal constitution of the environmental protection law is written that any exposure which may be harmful or annoying should be prevented. It should be on scientific knowledge or experience. So if there's not enough scientific knowledge, it can also be justified just based on common sense and experience. And it must be significantly disturbed. So it's not enough that you're just a little bit annoyed. So it must be a certain level of disturbance and well-being of the population. And it should also take into account that some parts of the population may be more vulnerable. So that's the legal basis on which the regulations have been built up. And you see the challenge. I mean, if you look at the exposure response curves like that, where would you put the threshold? A lot of people think regulatory limits are like below, there's no health effects, above it becomes dangerous, which sometimes work, but for many environmental conditions like radiation or air pollution, it does not work. And here also, I mean, the curve does not tell you where you have put the threshold. So it's a level of judgment, it's a level of bringing together different evidences from different health effects. Obviously, this is only one. So this needs quite some process to make it systematic and to have some kind of objectivity put to it. So the approach we used was basically the same as proposed by the WHO in their guidelines. So in principle, it was decided where can we be sure that there's health effects? I mean, this is just symbolic, but let's assume here is a threshold where below that level, we don't really know whether something is going on, whether maybe this is just chance finding, if we look at all the studies. And then it still might be not reasonable to have such low levels because then it cannot be enforced. So at some point, and also in line with the regulation that there must be substantial or at least relevant risk, there you have to do some judgments about the acceptable risk, which is then put as the level. And here would then be the level. So basically, to summarize, it's science-based. We have decided that we do separate guidelines for road, rail, and aircraft noise, just because we see for different health effects that there are different exposure response curves for these different sources, and it is plausible that maybe road have a different shape than railway, which has a different type of noise, or aircraft noise. And we have considered that basically nuisance or annoyance, that this should have basically the same weight as somatic health effects like diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So that was also one priority decision, that both get about the same weight. Then we applied the typical evidence evaluation criteria. So it really must be good evidence that there is a relation, a plausible association, a pathophysiological point of view, that we know that there's something on, and maybe something which is very special in the field of noise, at least that our commission thought would be relevant, is that the transferability of exposure response curve from one context to another context is much more uncertain than, let's say, for air pollution, because usually these studies are done that you model exposure outside, and depending on how the buildings are built, different amount of noise comes inside. Even the exposure modeling is quite different. If you really look into the detail, it's not that standardized as you would expect. So maybe a model showing in, I don't know, in London 50 dB would be different than in Switzerland a model of 50 dB. It's quite amazing how little standardized this type of modeling is. So we wanted to give more weight on Swiss data, and we have also done research on this Swiss data so that we consider these to be most relevant. So it's not like a Swiss-centric perspective, but really we felt that it is important for this specific area to give at least 50% of the weight for the Swiss data and 50% of the international data. And that is, of course, a rough rule, and we can, in principle, one could discuss that, but that is the idea behind that. And then the most difficult part, what is an accepted risk? And we assumed that for noise annoyance, the maximum accepted risk would be that 25% of the population is annoyed, for sleep 15%, and for disease corresponding risks were 5% increase in the relative excess risk for ischemic heart disease, and for 2.5 for cardiovascular mortality, and for diabetes 20%. And so this is just how you would then do it. Basically, you would look at the curve, where is 25% annoyed, you have a point, and then you get a value. You can do the same thing for epidemiological study, where do you have an increased risk of 2.5% for mortality, you would get a value. And then we did this according to that scheme here. So we did it separately because this was written in the law. Annoyance should be protected and health effect. So we did for highly sleep disturbed and for highly annoyed. We did this exercise and did it separately for the Swiss data and for the international data, and took the mean value out of that. And for cardiovascular and diabetes, we did the same thing. Cardiovascular mortality data we had from the Swiss study that I've showed before. Ischemic heart disease mortality, we took an international global review. And for diabetes, we had done a meta-analysis with Swiss and international data. So this get 3 intermediate value. Again, we took the mean value. And because the law said that we have to protect from both, lower of the 2 values was then taken as a proposal. And here you see the values that have been proposed. So for road, the day limit would be 60 dB, the night 52, for railway 95 and 56, and for aircraft 54 and 43. And it's quite interesting if you look into details. Nuisance, so this is mainly derived by annoyance, so by the left side, whereas for road traffic, the adverse effect on cardiometabolic diseases were most determined, and for the rest, basically the same values came out whether you took the annoyance or the health effects. You see the levels are quite higher than what the WHO has proposed. So that's certainly something to discuss. But I think it's also important not only to focus on the level, but also on other things. So further recommendations which are new to these guidelines is that for office space, one would be more relaxed than for residential house. So that's something, if it's built very well. What would be more stringent is that the point of measurements needs to be at the most exposed part of the facade, which is not the case now. That the nighttime period becomes longer, from instead until 6 o'clock, now until 7 o'clock. So that would also be a more stringent thing. And that we only have one type of residential area, which would put what is currently called the mixed area, also to the more quiet zone. So all this together, and there's also no corrections due to little traffic, which is an issue today. So all this would also be issues, at least the 4 later points, which points towards lower limits than what we have before. So basically, this proposed new regulations is based on scientific. We had an approach to do it as objective as possible. Obviously, it costs if you want to adhere to these limits, but we also have to be aware that each year transportation noise causes external cost of 2.8 billion Swiss francs, health costs and so on. So that also comes with cost. And obviously noise abatement at the source is central. That is an important point. So we are convinced that it's important to revise this noise ordinance because it's really outdated. And now this report of this commission is with the Federal Council. We have not yet heard what will happen. So in principle, it can disappear in the drawer, but hopefully not. And something will happen with that and that the situation will be improved. Just one last slide, you cannot read it, but if it comes to noise regulation at the source, there's a lot of things that you actually can do. It's not like that you have to ban traffic, but you can use low noise tires, you can use speed limits, you can use lighter vehicles and so on. So it's not like a lot of people, when they think about noise controls, they think about noise barriers and sound insulation windows. This is really second priority and not really liked in urban spaces because this causes a lot of troubles if you have noise barriers. But there's many things that you could do at the source. So then let's stop here and many thanks for your attention.
So thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of those who are here on site and, of course, those who are watching via the live stream. Now is the time for the floor to be open to any questions that anyone may have, whether that be from the Zoom link. Please don't forget, if you are on the live stream, please don't forget to head on into the Zoom link if you want to ask questions there. I already have a question or two from the Zoom, but I will start with questions actually on site, if anybody happens to have any. Then I will go to the online questions that we have. And the first one, as you mentioned, not many people are actually aware of noise pollution as something that is so important for health. So how can we raise awareness for noise pollution effects on people?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I'm not a communicator. I think what is maybe helpful and what I skipped a bit here is that there are increasing activities to really calculate the impact of noise on a societal level. So, for instance, a recent report in the EU has just quantified how many people are exposed to levels which cause troubles, how many people are annoyed. So they come to the conclusion that 22 million people are highly annoyed due to noise in the European region. 6.5 million have sleep disturbance because of noise. And each year, 48,000 ischemic heart disease occur and 12,000 deaths due to noise. And I think this type of really showing the overall impact makes somehow maybe more transparent what is happening, because on an individual level, it's very difficult to observe any impact. And I think one problem is that a lot of decision makers actually, they have selected their living place in a way that they are not confronted with that type of exposure, and that is also maybe the reason why there's too little awareness on the level of decision makers. There's also a question.
If I understood correctly, in the graph you focused on a lot with the increase that is quite linear, you did not take into account that lower income people with lower income do have a higher risk of developing diabetes or heart disease by itself. Why did you not control for this variable for this analysis, if I understood correctly?
Yeah, that's a very important point, and we have controlled for that. So in all the studies, if we look at the Swiss nationwide study, we just controlled for it indirectly by taking education and socioeconomic factors and socioeconomic status of the neighborhood into the model. So factors which are directly related to this type of socioeconomic status, this is controlled for. If we have data from prospective studies and like in Zapaldia, but also in many Scandinavian studies, then they have also individual data on risk behavior like smoking, physical activity, and so on. And then you can take that into account as well, in addition to the socio-demographic factors. What we see is actually the confounding factors. Typically, if you account for socio-demographic factors, you already get quite similar estimates in these studies that have additional information. That maybe the individual factors are not really confounding factors. Sometimes it's even maybe on the pathway, so maybe people don't have a lot of physical activity, also because of noise, because the environment they are living is not very friendly to move around and things like that.
So in this graph you focused on primarily you did take this into account. Yeah. Okay, so that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. But I would expect that, for instance, this impact shown here on the slides, people with a lower socio-demographic factors are more affected by it. So it's also a source of inequity in Europe and in many countries.
You mentioned about at the policy level, potentially policymakers not necessarily being as aware of the noise effects. What about when people are going to visit their general practitioners, their healthcare practitioners generally, and they complain about, I don't know, any number of health effects that you've mentioned there? What do you think are the chances that healthcare practitioners recognize the effects of noise pollution in these kind of circumstances? How much awareness is there within the medical community?
Yeah, that's also an interesting question. I would say in general there's not that much of awareness unless people really talk directly about noise. But if you look at the typical, for instance, cardiovascular risk scores, there's a lot of factors coming into that, like diet and physical activity and other factors. But interestingly, nothing like environmental air pollution or noise. And to some extent, you may say, okay, this is justified because on an individual level, this extra contribution is relatively low. But I'm not, and there are also discussions with clinicians I think it would be interesting to really look deeper into that and see whether people who are already at a higher risk to develop such a disease, if then actually the relative contribution of noise and maybe also air pollution is actually much higher than what is seen on a population level.
One of the questions that we had in was, since you had mentioned specifically about babies and the effect of noise pollution on babies, and there are lots of there's so many different parental advice that exists out there, but there are many parents who recommend raising their babies around lots of noise so that they can get well adapted into different environments and potentially they would sleep better as adults. Is this a myth? Is this misinformation? What can you say to that? I mean, because looking at what you explained here, it looks like...
Yeah. I really don't know, to be honest. I mean, anecdotally, you often hear this, that people who who are not used to noise in childhood and then come to a city, that they have more troubles than children if they are already used. And I think on a subjective level, this is certainly true, that if you are used to a certain sound and maybe also in different culture, that it can be even difficult if you don't hear it. I think this is on a subjective level. But to what extent is also true on a disease level and somatic level, I think there's little information. We had the chance to analyze, or colleagues of us have analyzed from the sleep lab in Basel and Zurich, where they had actimeter data from children in the first years of life, where they have collected it several times. And we looked into the association with the traffic noise at their home. And we haven't seen strong associations. There was a certain signal for children who didn't have a sibling. So maybe they're really protected, but even if you have a sibling, then any noise effect would be minor for these children. So also based on the experience from my children, I feel that actual children are quite resistant to noise. So maybe that's one of the few examples, but I don't really can prove it, that actually the older you get, the more troubles you get with that type of exposure, and children can cope with it quite well. Also, if it comes to adolescents, we also see that there are surveys in adolescents about noise annoyance, and usually the proportion of adolescents saying that they are annoyed is quite low, because they not even perceive it, but then there are these studies that you can see that they become aggressive and things like that. So somehow they react on the noise, but they don't make the connection that this is really disturbing them in a way.
Thank you. Perhaps we have time just for one more question, which I will take from one of the online viewers. And you mentioned that you're... okay, I have two questions here. The question is if you think that the main point of intervention is at the regulation level, or raising awareness among individuals, or perhaps at the city or regional level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced environmental issues are always an issue on very important that you do the structural prevention, and this includes regulation. I mean, you cannot avoid noise or air pollution on an individual level, or at least it's very limited. So, and actually, it's also very interesting in the case of air pollution. You have a lot of progress and a lot of success done on the regulation level, and usually the acceptance for this type of regulation is relatively high. But on the other hand, if there's no awareness, then obviously it's very difficult to create regulation, because the politicians, they need support to do that. So in a way, both goes hand in hand, I would say.
Thank you very much. Thanks for answering all the questions, and also for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this area. It's been very interesting. I'm going to have to slowly wrap up the session, as we're coming to the end of the time, and the live stream unfortunately cuts off automatically, okay. Which means that if I keep you answering more questions, those people will not be able to listen to your answers, unfortunately, in a few moments. I will just get myself set up here. The live stream viewers, you may be seeing a blank screen, but don't panic. In just a moment, there'll be a short slide which will come up on the screen to let you know a little bit about what will be coming up next. Hopefully you can start to see this slide. It's just a final slide as we are ending this session now. And it's just to once again thank Professor Röösli for being with us and for sharing his important research in this field. I'm aware that you're probably not seeing the screen anymore, but if that's the case, then not to worry, I will just read out actually the information on the screen to you. It's just a general notice to let you know that what is coming up next week will be a lecture by Professor Jennifer Inauen on changing health behavior from mechanisms to action. So she is the head of Department of Health, Psychology and Behavioral Medicine at the Institute of Psychology at the University of Bern. So please do join us for that next lecture. And it is coming up. She will be here with us at the ETH main building on site, and she will also be live streamed, as will all of our sessions. So we hope to catch you then, and in the meantime, wish you a very nice evening, and thank you once again to Professor Martin Röösli.